people who were not killed migrated to other countries, to Russia, to Lebanon, to Syria, to Egypt, to France, and the United States. In each of these places, post-genocide colonies of Armenians were formed. Now, what about Lebanon? Well, the community that came to Lebanon, Armenians came, many of them came from Cilicia, and they found Armenians already in Lebanon. Those who were in Lebanon before the genocide were primarily Catholics, who had fled persecution by apostolic Gregorian Armenians in the 19th century. And their primary identity was with Catholicism. By the 20th century, they had lost the use of the Armenian language, they spoke Arabic, and to a lesser extent, French. And they were already intermarrying with the Maronites. These first Armenian settlers, then, were joined by a second round of immigration, now apostolic Armenians, more ethnically conscious. And those two communities existed before the 1920s, coexisted but separately, and the newcomers were more receptive to Armenian nationalism. They even founded a Dashnar committee. But then there was the third immigration from the deportations and massacres. The survivors, orphaned, without resources, who came in their tens of thousands and lived in refugee camps. About 200,000 survivors reached the Syrian desert and settled in the districts of Aleppo, Damascus, and the village of Hauran. These tens of thousands who had entered Lebanon after the war were divided linguistically, socially, and religiously. For instance, Cilician Armenians, who made up the bulk of the Lebanese Armenians, were largely Turkish speakers. And they were largely middle class and had a high percentage of Catholics and Protestants among them. If Armenians had come from central and western Anatolia, they also spoke Turkish, but also a little Armenian, and were fairly well-to-do. They had also some Catholics and Protestants. But the Armenians from historic Armenia, from eastern Anatolia, still retained Armenian, were among the poorest of the immigrants, almost entirely members of the Armenian Apostolic Church. So you see, there were different religious affiliations, different linguistic affiliations, some rich, some poor. The identity, the major identity, and you could still find this in the United States when I was a child, was a local identity. What town had you come from? Not even, we all accepted you were Armenian, but Vorderatsia, what place are you from? Are you Arab-Kertsi? Are you Bolsetsi, that is from Istanbul? Are you from Vanetsi? My grandmother was from Diyarbakir, which Armenians call Dikranakertsi. Was your affiliation religious or primarily nationalist, etc.? Now, the way that divided community became more coherent was largely through the effort of the Dashnag party. The Dashnags decided we probably are not going to be able to return to Anatolia, and certainly not to Soviet Armenia in the short run. We need to create a new Armenian community here in Lebanon. And they did this largely through the schools. They did this through creating schools and creating a curriculum with a nationalist ideology. And they were extraordinarily successful. They also integrated themselves into Lebanese society through the politics. Lebanon was a kind of communal society, so they had their own communal representation, and it worked rather well. And that party became the dominant group. What it meant was that through that nationalizing effort, the Lebanese diaspora distinguished itself most abruptly from the non-Armenians, from the Arabs. Boundaries were created between Armenians and Otarner, and that is foreigners. We always call non-Armenians foreigners. I was confused of this as a child. I was living in America, born in America, and my grandmother would say, Menk Hayek, we're Armenian. Anong Amerikatsien, they're Americans. Anong Odarim, they're foreigners. There I was, 5 years old, I'm Armenian, living in America, but those Americans, they're the foreigners. It was a little confusing. And so there was this successful effort against Odaratsum, against this foreignization, which was largely reversed through this effort. Now, if we look at Soviet Armenia and the relations with Soviet Armenia, which I was discussing before, that also took a tremendous effect in my own community in the United States. There, the political battles between the Dashnags and the more hardline nationalist forces, and those who were willing to recognize and work with the Soviets, more, we would call them liberal democratic forces, because the party they were associated with, the Ramgavar party, is basically called the Liberal Democratic Party. And then further to the left, there were people who were very pro-Soviet, like my own family. And this conflict was carried out in the churches themselves, and it culminated in the 1930s, in 1933, with the murder of the Bishop Turyan in the church on Christmas Day, when he was stabbed to death by a number of assassins. Eventually, 9 Dashnags, members of the party, were convicted of the murder. That murder, which was an incredible event, divided the community absolutely. And that lasted well into the 1970s and even to some extent in the present time. And families divided on this, people didn't speak to one another. So the first major schism in the Armenian church actually took place in the United States. And later, in the 1950s, when the Dashnags took control of the Catholicos estate in Beirut, in Antillas, the church was divided throughout the world. Things finally begin to change, not so much during the Cold War. During the Cold War, these divisions are quite real. There's some affection for the Soviet Union that develops because Stalin decides that lands in eastern Anatolia, around Kars and Ardahan, should be returned to Armenia. These were lands which the Russians had won in 1877-78, and that returned to Turkey after World War I. And Stalin claimed these were Armenian lands, and there was a tremendous movement among Armenians supporting this. Even the Dashnak Suchun supported the return of the lands. Of course, Armenia again was caught in the politics of the Cold War. Turkey very wisely joined the West, joined the Anglo-American alliance against the Soviet Union, became a member of NATO, and this cause fell apart. In 1954, after Stalin's death, Molotov gave up the claims, and they don't exist anymore. By the 1960s, there was a new development. There was the development of what you can call genocide consciousness. Now, Armenians knew that an event had taken place, that their ancestors had been murdered by the Young Turks, but there were for many, it was the rebuilding of the community that was far more important before the 1960s. But in the 1960s, a number of things brought together what you can call the development of this consciousness. First of all, there was growing Holocaust consciousness. There was a new interest in the Jewish genocide of the 1940s. There was the Eichmann trial in Israel, the capture of Adolf Eichmann, the trial, Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a new debate about genocide, and a new interest in earlier examples of genocide that fit Raphael Lemkin's definition as he created it during World War II. So, Armenians, in 1965, there were demonstrations in Yerevan itself against, not against, but against the will of the Soviet regime. A monument eventually was created, and the genocide became a central rallying point for Armenians. You could say the focus of their new identity. And this, Armenians often will argue that this had always been there. There had always been some discussion, but it became far more important, far more relevant than ever before. By the 1970s then and 1980s, the distance between the two centers of Armenian life, the United States and the Soviet Republic was less acute than it had been before. Armenians centered their own idea of who they were around this idea of the genocide, and there was less antagonism toward Soviet Armenia. People began to travel there as well. The one certainty for Armenians in that period, before 1990-1991, was that life within the borders of one or the other superpower was the best guarantee for the future. That life in the Middle East, in Istanbul, and anywhere else would either lead to another exile or to assimilation. This calculation underwent serious revision with the outbreak of the Karabakh movement in February 1988, the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union, and the independence of Armenia. Now, the period after that, the last 15 years, or 20 years now, I would call the permanent crisis of independence. Armenia was now independent. There was tremendous, and there still is, tremendous pride in that independence. But for any Armenian who goes to Armenia from the diaspora, for many Armenians who go from the diaspora, there is regret with the mundane reality of that actual country. Tremendous discontent with the actuality of a kind of mafia state, of relative polarization of wealth, and what was to be an ideal homeland has looked to be far less attractive than it was in the earlier imagination. There has been very little Haydn Dartsutun, that is, return to the homeland. Indeed, the fact that Armenians don't return to the homeland, and Armenians, a huge minority of Armenians, some estimate as many as 40%, are leaving Armenia, creating a new Armenia in Glendale, California, means that the idea that we should somehow create a great, big, independent Armenian state and include the lands in eastern Anatolia is a fiction, is a utopia. Armenians find it very difficult to be attracted, to live in, to govern their own state, that small Caucasian state. And it's very interesting that the idea of an Armenia besides the one that exists has largely been marginalized. Political parties don't talk about that as actively anymore. There's the great fear, it seems to me, that somehow Armenians want their lands back in Turkey. Of course, in some ideal way, we'd like our lands back, right? Our lands, okay? But in fact, this is not a political reality. This is a kind of marginal utopian aspiration. I can say that because there's so few Armenians here. It's difficult to say that in an Armenian audience. There is